Sanchez-Jankowski, and while I am the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, I'm also the chair of the Center for Ethnographic Research, and I want to welcome all of you to our event today. Before I begin, I want to do two things. First, I want to actually announce an event, the next CER event, that is the Center for Ethnographic Research event. And we have invited Professor Ruth Braunstein, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut. And she will give her talk on, quote, prophets and patriots, faith and democracy across the political divide, close quote. And her talk will occur in this room on Thursday, November 16th from 4 to 5:30. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Institute for South Asia Studies, which is co-sponsoring the event. Now I actually want to ask all of you to check your cell phones and make them on silent mode. As you can tell, we're in a very small space, and when they ring for us, it is in fact quite disturbing to both the speaker and those of us trying to listen. As some of you might know, but many of you who are guests for the first time may not, the format is that our speaker speaks for about 45 minutes, and she's indicated her talk is 47 minutes, and we'll allow her to go the 2 extra minutes over. And when she's finished, most times there's lots of questions, and she will, in fact, field these questions for about a half hour. And I will come up, and please raise your hand. I'll put you in a queue, and then she just answers as I give her the names for in the queue. So she doesn't really choose who it is. I will do that. So with that as a preamble, let me take this opportunity to introduce our speaker today. We have Sharika Thiranagama, who is assistant professor of anthropology, and Sakurako, is that Sakurako? I guess and William Fisher Family Faculty Scholar in the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. She received her PhD in social anthropology from the University of Edinburgh, and her research spans both Sri Lanka and South India, for which she will address us today. She is the author of In My Mother's House, Civil War in Sri Lanka, which is published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2011. She will be speaking today on, quote, Who is Your Neighbor? Caste, Dignity, and Dalit Lives in Central Kerala. Please join me in welcoming Professor.
Thank you all for coming, and sorry that I had to reschedule from the free speech, from your free speech week to a quiet and less alt-right time as a whole. And I really want to thank Martin and Deborah and Harpreet and also Punita and Lawrence at the South Asia Center for inviting me and making this event possible. And I'm really excited to share this stuff from my newest project and my newest fieldwork, and I'm going to try to explain some of the India-centric categories as much as I can, but please ask me questions about it. If I feel like if I'm skipping over stuff or taking for granted certain kinds of things. So I'm just going to start because, I have this time to talk, and I'm going to try not to go over time as much as I can. So, living in America reminds me continually that histories of subordination, inequality, and humiliation never quite go away. These histories are sedimented within long-standing structures of exclusion and everyday struggles and humiliations encountered in conversation and interactions with others. I'm part of all these Facebook groups for women of color in academia, and what people talk a lot about is actually things that happen in everyday conversations with other people. Similarly, the rise of Dalit, that is formerly untouchable caste movements in India, as well as the vicious and violent backlash against such movements, which you can see in the rise of violence against Dalits since the 1990s, is an example of the deep weight of histories of subordination and the personal and political struggles of these communities. Dalits, or you can say scheduled caste communities, comprise around 200 million people scattered all across India, and they were and are subject to historically deep subordination within elaborate and regionally variegated caste systems, including residential segregation, restricted commensality, caste endogamy, and caste-ordered labor. Dalit communities are fighting not only for just the routine implementation of political legal rights and policies that have been in the Constitution since 1947, but they also fight for the right not to be killed or beaten, for intercaste relationships, to have access to public source of water, to be seated with others, to share food, and other everyday humiliations of life with other castes. As Mander points out, in rural India, behind dramatic acts of violence, there are everyday realities where, quote, in numerous quotidian acts, Dalits are constantly reminded of their subordinate status, end quote. In 2015 and 16, I conducted fieldwork with predominantly female agricultural laborers in the Palakkad district of Kerala. And to give you an idea of why agricultural laborers, in 1991, 49.6% of Dalits across India are agricultural laborers. The next category of workers are 20.54% are cultivators, including sharecroppers. So you have around 3/4 of Dalits are involved in the agricultural economy. 81% of Dalits live in villages. So in fact, rural agricultural life is very central to understanding Dalit life all across India, not just in Kerala. Palakkad is also one of the major heartlands of the Communist Party, a Marxist, CPM, in the historically Communist Party dominated South Indian state of Kerala, and Kerala has been lauded for its welfare states, its workers' right, and its politically strong and literate and associational civil society. Now, Palakkad has also the highest concentrations of Dalits in Kerala, and despite land reform and other major forms of public action by the state of Kerala, Palakkad district has lower wages and worse working conditions for agricultural laborers than any other part of Kerala. So these kind of contradictions drove my research. And Dalits in Kerala inherit a long history of Dalit emancipatory movements, as well as a history of Communist Party action. And this Communist Party action has framed social change through languages of emancipation, liberation, equality, and transformation. But the Communist Party has consistently understood equality through a language of class that has erased the specificity of Dalit and tribal struggles. But today, what I really want to talk about is how people live together with other castes and classes in small town and rural Kerala, what I call the problem of neighborliness. And I propose that neighborliness is a real challenge for landless laborers, as large-scale social transformations in Kerala have produced neighborhoods out of former workplaces, and where your former landlord is now your neighbor. And this raises the question of how to negotiate relationships that are no longer structured only by work, but also by forms of sociality that are necessarily intercaste. And so I'm going to talk very briefly first about questions of respect, dignity, and worth, which have been very central to Dalit movements in India. I'm going to talk about the neighbor, which is not a local term, it's my analytical term that I'm sort of imposing on this. And then the second half of the talk, I'm going to really then talk about what does this look like ethnographically? What does it look like on the ground? How do people talk about everyday acts of living with other people as neighbors? And it's important because in these neighborhoods I worked in, they are distant from Dalit activism in the sense that they're not in Chennai, they're not in Tamil Nadu where you have these big movements, but they're not distant from caste discrimination or the kinds of transformations that have been wrought all across Kerala. And throughout the talk, I'm going to switch between Dalit, which I find a respectful term, so I'm going to use Dalit when it's the narrative voice is my own, and I'm going to use scheduled caste, SC, when the voices of the people I worked with, because they generally call themselves SC, or others SC. So the bulk of my fieldwork was with the formerly enslaved, and I'm not talking about it here, but there are a lot of court records to show that the communities I worked with were bought, sold, and rented as individuals until emancipation in 1843. But that's a big topic. But I do try to look at slavery in my larger work. And so I work with these communities, Kanakan Charama, Pulaya Charama, and Paraya communities, and with their current landlords and fellow laborers from the OBC, which are called other backward castes, which are Irawas. My friend and research assistant Vinu Palashari and I carried out interviews, participant observation. We did household genealogies in 4 colonies in a rural panchayat. 3 of them were single caste Dalit colonies, and one of them, K colony, was mixed, though predominantly Dalit, with Irawa, the OBC. And that's the colony I'm really going to draw a lot from today, because that's where people had to think about what it meant to be neighbors, because it wasn't as segregated as the other colonies I worked in. So let me start by first talking about how treating people as human beings, as people would say. So in one Dalit colony, Vinu and I were having tea with a group of 6 women, young and old, and we were talking about their relationships with Irawas, that's the OBC, the other backward class communities that were dominant in the area. And Irawas are the kind of formerly lower caste. Lower caste actually doesn't mean still considered higher than Dalits. Dalits are really at the bottom end. And they're the community that the Dalit communities are most likely to live with and interact with regularly. And OBCs are basically all across India, and there's a kind of middle lower castes. And they're the most numerous castes across India and in Kerala as a whole. We don't have an official census, but pretty much everybody knows that those are really the numerous castes. We heard familiar stories of restricted commensality. What do you think of the fact they won't eat with you? I asked, cursing myself as I said it for the naivety of the question. One of the younger women raised her eyebrows at me. They are not civilized, she answered with a shrug of her shoulders. Quote, they do not know how to treat people as human beings, many of them. Unquote. The accusation is pointed. One's capacity for civilized behavior is not measured by how one treats others of one's own caste or higher, but how one treats Dalits. Vinu and I had actually heard these kind of comments all the time. People assumed that upper castes and Irawas would treat each other as humans with respect and care. What these statements were about was whether they could treat Dalits as if they were human. And so these comments were not embedded in the idea of free-floating humanity as such. They were embedded in and come through a long history of caste discrimination and Dalit activism in India, where essentially humanness has been distributed by caste and where Dalit lives have not been treated as having worth. And so I heard very often this common comment, a human is a human, and it was uttered as a kind of clincher after you told the story of caste discrimination. And it was about, and in many ways it indicated to me that humanity and respect were to be anchored not only in how you as an individual treated each other, but within a categorical relationship of how individuals as caste categories treated each other. Now, debates around ideas of dignity, respect, and recognition were major questions in 18th and 19th century Europe for theorists like Immanuel Kant. And in the longer version, I have a long piece about Kant, but I'm not going to do that as a talk today. In seeking new ethical principles amidst the reconfiguration of European society and the undermining of existing aristocratic hierarchies, which were themselves based on differential attributions of respect and difference. However, as Rebecca Scott also shows, strong notions of dignity and respect entered public discourse prior to any enshrinement in law through abolitionism and the global abolitionist movement. So, for example, she talks about post-slavery Louisiana and how dignity became this kind of term within public debate as something, as she says, carrying descriptive weight and meaning, capable of linking features of lived experience with a definite diagnostic and normative concept, end quote. And she talks about how this also, dignity still carried that weight 100 years later in somewhere like Brazil as well, to talk about past and present humiliations. If you think about the Black Lives Matter statement, dignity is very prominent in all of these in all of these statements. Languages of dignity and respect continue to be important in penetrating everyday languages and conceptions of the self in relation to unequal relations with others. Now this history is quite similar in India, in fact, where you have respect being transformed from hierarchical deference to a critique of inequality. So historically, from a Dalit perspective, the caste system revolves around performing and allocating respect and deference from lower caste to higher caste, and is articulated around the norm of only offering respect within your own caste categories, never to those below. Visible respect towards upper caste and systematic humiliation of untouchables are the motors of the system. This is a kind of Ambedkar, it's a very Ambedkarite summary in some ways. However, as in Western Europe, the meaning of respect has transformed from hierarchical position to an expression of egalitarianism. So if you take the Tamil term Maryada, which in Malayalam you can say as Maryada, the key term of caste deference is now transformed. While upper caste in contemporary Tamil Nadu lament that they can no longer get respect, Maryada, Dalits and OBC communities assert that Maryada towards them, respect towards them, is central to equality and reversing caste humiliation. And these kind of notions of respect and self-respect in colonial India were adopted by both these lower caste, now OBC communities, and Dalit movements. It was kind of across these spectrums, and they articulated themselves around modernist languages of reform, progress, transformation, and profound structural inequality was understood through this historically potent language of dignity and autonomy that was also circulated in India through Christian missionaries and abolitionists as well, through actually the anti-slavery movements as well as the missionization, and the engagement of lower caste reformers, both lower and untouchable caste, with in fact these formulations of dignity and autonomy and freedom circulating in Europe and America. So Fuller was very inspired by Thomas Paine, for example. There's a long history of that kind of engagement. So if you look at the 1926 South Indian self-respect movement, which is spearheaded by the arch-rationalist atheist Periyar, that actually sought to reorder Brahminical hierarchies through kind of very political, mundane transformations in habitual practice, abolishing ritual. Sanal Mohan also traces the effect of missionary introduction of discourse of slavery in the conversion of Dalits in colonial Travancore in Kerala. And even though the missionaries did not always live up, and very frequently did not live up to the Enlightenment ideas of equality and liberty they preached, he shows that in southern Kerala among Dalit Puliyas, nonetheless, they gave these lenses were very much of self-respect, worth and dignity became very important to Dalit movements and Dalit leaders in how they, and slavery in how they then conceptualized their own movements. However, in India, while the rise in mobility of middle caste and OBC groups and their challenge of upper caste privilege has been one of the most important transformations of the India in the 20th century, those groups have only ambiguously extended rights to Dalit communities. So in Kerala, languages of self-respect, dignity, struggles against upper caste, respect for the labouring poor have been sedimented publicly through the OBC, middle caste, Irava community and Communist Party mobilizations, but have only indirectly involved recognition for Dalits. Indeed, across South India, most of the violence against Dalits in the last 20 years has been perpetrated by OBC and middle caste communities. And Dalit communities continue to experience severe forms of humiliation and exclusion that specifically target their seeming untouchability rather than simply discrimination against poor communities. Many communities and individuals are poor in India, but Dalits are continue to be treated differently. And moreover, and one really important thing to think about in that is that Dalit and OBC movements for dignity and respect, as well as the upper caste reform movements, were fundamentally centered on caste-based and community upliftment and formation rather than individual human dignity as such. So as Kaviraj remarks, such movements, quote, placed caste groups at the center of emancipation and made them, rather than the individual, the protagonist of individual change, end quote. So notions of self-respect, dignity and respect of individuals have always in India been historically linked, well always, since the 19th century, have been linked to the respect and dignity of communities at large, sometimes religious but most often caste communities. So how do we understand this in an ethnographic concept? And how does this actually work out in where I work in Palakkad, which, as I said, is distant from an active Dalit movement, but it inherits the effects of a long century of mobilization, including anti-slavery movements, and it inherits this kind of Communist Party language of equality and social transformation. Now, this mostly came up these questions came up in my fieldwork through discussions about everyday acts of neighborliness. So I'm just going to, if you forgive me, just talk a little bit about why I talk about the neighbor before I get to the ethnography. So to know somebody as a neighbor is in Raymond Williams's terms not a function of the object, but a function of, quote, what is desired and needed to be known, end quote. What makes it possible to regard some people as your neighbors, and what happens to make some people become visible as neighbors? So let me tell you a story about a woman I knew, Permeate, and she was like a agricultural laborer in her 60s. She'd been one since she was a child. She was a very fierce woman, I must say. And she was from a Dalit community. And she volunteered to take us to meet her former landlord, Janaki Amma, who was like in her 90s, and her sons, Sashi and his wife, Lakshmi. And most of the women we knew in the area, they worked for all the sons of one particular now dead landlord. And those 5 sons and their wives still lived in the area. They were the neighbors of all their laborers. And, so you live next door to each other, and all of those landlords, they were Irava. So Prema Chaichi, in contrast to her usual demeanor, was subdued and withdrawn when she took us to see Janaki Amma. While she was older than Sashi, the son, she addressed him with the honorific Etan, which means older brother, while he did not use the honorific Chechi, which means older sister. They greeted her, they told her to come inside, they told her to sit inside with us, and she sat very uncomfortably in the chair in the corner. And they told her, no, you can eat, why don't you eat? A few weeks later, we told another man, like a local Dalit man, of this meeting, and he smiled at us half reproachfully. Oh, that family, he said, that man, Janaki Amma's husband, he treated his workers like slaves. He would go and drag Prema Chechi's husband from their house by his hair if he thought he was late for work. End quote. Down the road from Prema Chechi's house was Velimani Chetan, also Dalit, a soft-spoken, articulate man who was a long-standing member of the CPM. He'd become an agricultural laborer at the age of 14. He left school after his father died to support his mother and siblings. And as soon as he could, he left agricultural labor and went into construction, which is what most men wanted to get out of labor into doing. And through this construction work, he was able to buy his own house on one of the lands that belonged to one of the landlord's son. Now, first, that landlord had actually refused to sell it to him and sold it to somebody else external. Then he went and bought it from that person external for a higher price, and now they lived next door to each other, but there was no interaction between these houses at all. They just pretended that the other person doesn't exist. So Velimani Chetan repeated something we heard countless times. The time, that was about 20 years ago, when workers were bound in multiple nets of obligation, service and debt to the landlords, was now over. His proximity and lack of interaction with his next door neighbor was an example. So we asked him, would Irava laborers ever come and work for a Dalit landlord, we asked him. Chetan was unequivocal. Even if there was such a thing as a Dalit farmer cultivator, and we could only trace 2 people who had even leased very small plots, then he said only other SCs and your family would work for you. Irava laborers would never work for an SC. Now, Velimani Chetan's story and our kind of awkward visit with Prema Chechi illustrated this constant feature of my research in Palakkad. There are historical changes. New things have happened, but they're still very sticky with the weight of their histories. Now, the term neighbor is a figure that carries a very profound philosophical weight within European thought. And unlike the term dignity, it doesn't have its own historical or political genealogy. In India, there's no long-term concept of the neighbor. This is a new thing. Just like the phenomenon I'm discussing, it's a new thing. In Western theological and philosophical writing, the neighbor has been used to designate that proximate figure which is not kin, but to whom one may owe obligation and responsibility, and is a different ethical terrain from your family or your partner, for example. And I'm using it analytically rather than as a local term to understand what happens when people who always live next door to each other in a locality which was formed primarily around exploitative work, then through infrastructural and economic change becomes a rural neighborhood. And suddenly you have to recognize each other's houses and each other as co-residents. So I'm using neighbor to try and combine the kind of existential, the sociological, and the geographical here. Now, of course, the most famous person to write about the neighbor, or not the famous, most influential, is Emmanuel Levinas in Totality and Infinity and in Otherwise Than Being. And he talks about the figure of the neighbor exactly as that proximate other or stranger who interrupts and demands from us a fundamental responsibility. And the other is always appearing from a position of height to the eye. And it's very funny. I see one of my students who I taught Levinas to in my class, so let's hope I get it just right. For Levinas, ethics is the acceptance of responsibility for the demand that the other places upon us, an asymmetric demand which leaves us vulnerable and exposed, and that we maintain the other as fundamentally altered, as mysterious and ungraspable. Now, Levinas resists the idea that alterity could have a categorical connotation. For him, the other is simply that which is not ourselves. But, as Bernasconi argues, to actually understand an ethical charge to Levinas's argument, we have to actually say that there is some, how do we think about the alterity content of the other? So Bernasconi suggests that the ethically other is always haunted by the figure of the ethnically other, the one who is actually different, not just simply proximate to us. And this makes a lot, we had to think about that because in a context where caste orders have classified individuals as inherently different and differently human, is it possible for us to encounter each other outside of kind of sense-making categories that make other people recognizable? I mean, can we encounter it in such a way that we can shelve categorical encounters within our ethical conundrums? Can we be like Levinas and say it's just simply the other? Neighborliness, for those I work with, is built upon an unbanishable, seemingly bodily difference and caste inequality. Yet the continuing presence of such inequality does not preclude Dalits and other lower caste desires that people treat each other as human beings, as equals. And actually, I mean, there's a lot of writing about how Levinas is also talking about a real figure. He is talking about being Jewish in Europe. I mean, so to some extent, or he always identifies the widow, the orphan. So he says it's non-categorical, but then certain categories always prop up. But that's another discussion also. Dalit insistence on equality within intercaste relations necessarily takes us beyond Levinas's insistence on the separation of the ethical and the political, where he says the ethical is responsibility for the other, and then the political is symmetrical and redistributive justice. I mean, so Zizek suggests, for example, that we could see politics as a link that tries to force a relationship between the ethical and justice. Here too, I propose we give very serious thought to alterity content and the political struggles over recognition, inclusion, visibility, and discrimination, and the historical transformations and possibilities that make everyday relationships between people potentially ethical ones. In responding to philosophical treatments of the neighbor as a proximate social figure, the concrete historical and social question of who the neighbor is and how we construct somebody as being our neighbor are far from given. This is where historians, sociologists, and anthropologists have a great deal to offer to philosophers, because we can actually discuss what happens when your landlord becomes your neighbor, how you manage neighborly relations within histories of deep caste inequalities, how do you live or rather imagine a life with others that meaningfully recognizes your own worth. And I see these sorts of questions, which sound very highfalutin, as very everyday ethical conundrums that had to be lived daily by the people that I worked with, and it's to those realities I now turn. So let me start with how the locality actually became a neighborhood and talk about the historical background. So where I work, Palakkad district was part of British Malabar, which in the colonial empire was known as being a very rigid, caste-based, large landowner agricultural economy, more rigid than other parts of what is now Kerala. And this economy was very much constituted through caste relationships with land and agricultural labor. So if I can explain, every inch of land was owned right down to the riverbed by like these large housing complexes by upper caste Nayars and Nampudris. They would own all the housing land. Some private individuals, once again, mostly from the upper castes. The housing estates were joint families. Then you have some private individuals, and then you'd have big temples and residential bodies, which were also very often Brahmin. And so while these Nampudri, Naya and Tamil Brahmin housing complexes were very well defined ritually and physically, rural villages in Malabar were not. You don't have the same kind of village thing that you have in Tamil Nadu, for example. There was no common land, no common grazing, no common pond. And laborers were always seen as resident on somebody else's land. So a lot of the areas that I encountered, they were laid out in particular ways because there would be an upper caste household, and then there would be service relationships around that. Or the upper caste household would not be there, it would be very distant, but nonetheless there was where all the fields were, so that's where everybody was laid out. And this is important because most of South India, untouchable communities are barred from living close to upper caste, and segregation marks caste differentiation. And Kerala is the most extreme in South India because proximity was measured. And Irava could only be 16 feet from Naya, Dalits could only be 64 feet. So it was and what it really meant is you have very rigid segregation in living areas, and in public spaces like parks, Dalits were not allowed to be on the same path at the same time as an upper caste or Irava man. You had to get out. There were all kinds of negotiations around public space. All the labor relations were also structured to caste because upper caste Nampudri and Tamil Brahmins were forbidden from engaging in any form of manual labor, and all the upper caste saw any form of labor as demeaning. And then they would have these kind of big housing complexes with temples and livestock and so on around them and in far-flung areas, and then they would lease the agricultural land to other tenants who were also from dominant castes and OBC castes, and then those people would lease their land possibly further to Muslims and OBC castes, and those people would have Dalits working as laborers. And so the only people who actually do any form of manual labor were basically the agricultural laborers. And the bulk, while some were Irava, the bulk of agricultural labor has always historically been from these Dalit communities I worked with. Now, in all the colonies I worked in, the laborers could trace 3 or 4 generations back where they'd been brought to work in the area. So they'd been given these residential plots. Iravas were also brought like that, but they were given often larger plots, and that you could see that in the way that the neighborhoods then worked out. Iravas were allowed inside the Irava landlords' houses, but not Dalits. There was always a separation between who could do work inside the home and who could not. And 2 major shifts happened to make these workplaces into neighborhoods. Firstly, you had throughout the 60s and 70s land reform movements and amendments which were proposed by a communist government, enacted by a Congress government with pressure from the communist movement. And these reforms capped agricultural land ownership at 15 acres. It redistributed excess land, and it transferred land from their landowners to their tenants. That's very important. So all the people you subcontracted, they were then given the land lease. And they were predominantly from the OBC castes and also some Muslims, but not for the landless laborers. They didn't get any cultivated land because they were not tenants. They were eligible to receive some of the excess land, but 20 years on, most of them haven't actually received the excess land. So for Dalits, cultivating land was never made actually available to them. And for the laborers I work with, their distant landlords who they had actually never met, vanished, their Brahmin upper caste landlords. Their tenant landlords who actually oversaw their work and who they were entangled with in deeply inequitous relationships now became their official landlords. And this is borne out above the board by people from the writing about the land reforms from the 80s and 90s onwards, that actually very little benefit for Dalits in land reform. Over the Dalits who are actually the backbone of the wetland rice agriculture in Kerala remain overwhelmingly landless. What they did receive instead was, under this scheme Kudikudappu, is that they could purchase the land they already lived on, their housing. plots. And so this is what made a neighborhood possible, because now you could own your land that you lived on and you could pass it on. And from the 80s onwards, you had all these big panchayat schemes, which then gave you schemes for Dalit, like a lakh, to make improvements. So you could then turn your house into like a proper house. You could make it into a brick and concrete. So with the possibility of actual improvements and inheritance, it came to look much more like a neighborhood. And the municipality started building roads, not in all, but in some parts. The other big change is through the kind of collapse of the agricultural economy in Kerala in some ways, and the way that real estate basically becomes much more valuable than agricultural land, this kind of flipping of agricultural land into real estate. So you see that, I mean, there's lots of complicated things around that with migration, but basically by the 80s and 90s, you see that people turn their fields into residential areas. So you get more like neighborhood-like fields. But Dalits, still lose out in that because they don't really have great residential land, and their wages basically stay stagnant. They get a raise in wages in the 70s, but it remains fairly stagnant. And even though working conditions do improve, they're still very much at the bottom end of the agricultural economy. There's profound male flight from the 1980s onwards out of agriculture. So what you also see is that agricultural labor in contemporary Palakkad is really what older and middle-aged women do. Young Dalits do not want to become laborers because it's seen very much as being a caste status, about being Dalit. Iravas do not want to be laborers because they also see it as being a Dalit thing. So really what you have is that you just have these older women, and there's less jobs for them because of tractorization, because the landlords think that they're paying too much for them you have less jobs, mainly women, and you have neighborhoods which have like kind of better houses and with loads of people hanging out in them, mainly women. People aren't going to, they become dense, very social spaces because there are people, there are women there all the time, for example. So this is how the new neighborhoods emerge out of localities where people had lived in proximity. And these transformations in working conditions and wages, including men working outside the locality, families improving their houses, they do enable the localities to become neighborhoods. And this is very different then from when most families there worked as laborers for the local landlords. And as young men, and generally young men and young women, go to school and college and work outside the colonies, you see the colony filled with middle-aged women at daytime. And so even more generally, the neighborhood is where most women's lives are lived. Even for middle-class Malayali women who work, mobility is highly restricted. Any woman who works in Kerala knows, despite its so-called progressive credentials, after 7 o'clock you really aren't supposed to be out at night. You're only supposed to be you can be inside the mall, sari emporium, or in restaurants, but really the night is a space for men to sit around in tea shops, in Communist Party offices, toddy shops, junctions, union meeting places. For working class agricultural female laborers of all castes had very little life outside the colony. You work inside the locality, you go outside for the clinic, the bank, for political rallies where you get bussed out, temple festivals, weddings, but most of your socialization and your life is lived within this space of the economy, of the locality / neighborhood, which was once your workplace, and it's actually the site of the rural agricultural economy. Now, neighborliness was textured by this kind of everyday hanging out that people did in front of their houses, and social functions like weddings, so many marriage-related parties and functions that I had to go to, funerals, homecomings, going to bring women home from their natal families after they have babies and confinements. And it's in these social functions that you also see prospects for future marriages and so on. So many of these functions were intra-caste within the caste community. However, many were also intercaste, in as much as they were expected to be neighborly functions as opposed to caste ones. So let me talk about what the difference is between the intra-caste and the intercaste here. So the most dominant intra-caste neighborly relations were groups of men. So families were commonly imagined as a group of brothers, their in-marrying wives, and their children. But while men provided the family structure, women actually provide most of the sociality. And then each of these married men are part of what in that area you call the desham. And that means you're part of a group within your caste, that you observe death rituals for each other, you help out at each other's weddings and at funerals, you arbitrate in the case of censor for intercaste marriages. The fine for making an intercaste marriage in the Dalit Desam that I worked was 5,000 rupees. You had to pay to the Desam if you had an intercaste marriage. And it's in K colony, which is very large, it was very well established, you gave 50 rupees every month to your Desam. Other places I worked, it was less established, you didn't give that kind of regular money for collective expenses. Every caste had its own Desham. There were Dalit ones, there were OBC ones, and so on. And the neighborhood was constituted around these kind of Desam structures, these caste structures. Intercaste relations were work-related and around social functions. So normally, until the collapse of the village economy, when you marry as a woman, you marry into a work group. So you inherit a slot from your mother-in-law. So generally, in your work group of about 10 to 12 women, you are working with your mother-in-law and your sister-in-law. Oh joy, for the same landlord. And women talked all the time about the problems of working with your female kin at work and in your household. It's very isolating to then work with your mother-in-law for most of the day. But it's also within work that women make friends across family and caste, because they are intercaste work groups. They also have Iravas. And they negotiate forms of friendship and caste discrimination simultaneously. So we met Irava women through our Dalit friends, through their work groups they had been in together. And so you had all kinds of intercaste relationships in work, with your landlord, which is intercaste, and also with fellow laborers. And you're also now neighbors together. But rather than political and class solidarity between the communist voting laborers, they all worked for the Communist Party, caste was very much at the forefront between the laborers themselves. So some very much older practices had lapsed. So, Irava women used to tell us that their mother-in-laws would bathe as soon as they got home from work to rid themselves of the pollution of working with SCs. So they said, well, we don't do that anymore. But as our Dalit friends kept on reminding us, while caste has changed, it has not gone away. So Ponni Veliamma, her daughter-in-law Radhika, and other neighbors, including Premachetti, told us of one Irava woman, Soundari, in her work group, who had accidentally eaten something from another woman's food. And as soon as she found out it was a Dalit woman, one of the SC women in the group, she went off and made herself vomit. So this kind of routine casteist behavior was above the board endured by Dalit women with those who they worked with. They didn't by any means tolerate it. They discussed it and they reminded each other of these moments. And they told us all the time that the Iravas were very invested in keeping caste. And one of the very common things that people told us all the time, Dalit women, were work days where Irava laborers would refuse to try the food that Dalit laborers had cooked. But it didn't mean that they weren't friends in the work group. They worked together for years. They shared lives, employers, they told each other stories and jokes. They discussed sex with their husbands, with other women in the work group, and they helped each other through difficult times. However, friendship did not mean that caste considerations did not apply. Everyone knew who observed caste discrimination and who didn't. And such caste-sharpened eyes were applied to the minute movements within the texture of everyday lives. It's very hard to put your finger on exactly, but it was ever present and constitutive how people thought about others. Dalits we met agreed that since the 1990s, interdining, that's dining together across caste, was more common. But I actually learned to ask follow-up questions to the, people say, oh, well, they do eat with us now. And then a follow-up question I would ask is like, but do the women eat? Because people constantly made a distinction between whether men interdined or women interdined. So interdining publicly was done by men outside of the locality or when they're sent as representatives of the family to social functions. Irava women and upper caste women rarely, if ever, interdined. So one man was very explicit. He said women keep the honor of the caste. So this constant differentiation between whether men and women came to eat in functions and houses recalled this subtle distinction of women as the fundamental keepers of caste. Men's commensality was seen as part of the official observation of an end to untouchability, but women's lack of participation was read as a real evidence of the kernel of caste in everyday life. In short, interdining by men signal the official and public disavowal of caste, but the continued observance of not eating in Dalit homes by women signal the private world of caste. And this kind of distinction between interdining, often communist men, and non-dining women, it actually ties in with a more general differentiation between the locality and the public world outside of the locality. So rules about commensality, eating together, were very different inside the locality and quite different in the kind of outside the locality, in the like municipal offices and in the town and so on. So in the eatery near the municipal offices, which is where I had my lunch, my 40 rupee lunch every day, Vinu and I would sit in these two benches in a small room with men of all castes, from the laborers to the village officer, and eat very crammed in. And this is part of the official public. So there you're not allowed to have conversations about caste. You're not allowed to say, oh, people shouldn't eat here. And we were allowed there as women because we were kind of class-marked oddities. I was like the Sri Lankan and her friend. And when some Dalit women we knew very well set up they set up a women's cooperative canteen inside the panchayat, and with the help of the CPM, and everybody came to eat there too. And nobody was allowed to not come because they were Dalit. People knew they were Dalit, but it was not a problem eating inside. But those people would not eat inside the homes in the locality. In the official public, everyone knew that caste observances and discrimination were not supposed to happen, even if it did in concealed fashion in some occasions. But inside the locality, it was okay. Everything was understood to be different. There, minute forms of caste differentiation and discrimination that served to remind Dalits they were Dalits actually not only resided, but it constituted the realm of the private, the locality, and the household. And it's actually there where more sociality, especially for women, actually transpired, not in the official public. The fact that the locality until the last decade also includes the agricultural economy and the life worlds of most men and almost all women points to the ubiquity of caste discrimination despite official prescriptions against it. And I call the kind of realm of the localities life you have with your family and neighbors and everyday sociality and functions, I call it the private public, which is a Habermasian term, in contrast to the official public. So I see the official public as a non-agricultural place where you have schools, workplaces, shopping areas, political rallies, party headquarters. The CPM needs no introduction, everyone just says the party. Cinemas, reading halls, discussion groups, so that's the official public. The private public, and Habermas uses a private public to talk about things that happen in the family salon. And he sees that as prior, these kind of bourgeois gatherings in bourgeois family homes that then give rise to the larger public. So I don't want to see the private public as prior to the official public, but I see it as parallel in this Indian context, and I see private public as working well to denote the everyday life of the locality, which always places outwardly orientated, heavily gendered and unequal but sentimentalized households in relation to like convivial relationships with other households. And it's in this private public that caste discrimination rests on the stuff of very ordinary discourse, interaction with familiar others. So if we juxtapose this official and private public, we see two things. Firstly, caste-structured relationships and caste discrimination are present only in disavowed form in the official public, and they're simultaneously understood to be the natural cornerstone of many private publics. Secondly, while you have endogamy and caste relations and family relations as a kind of necessary feature of community in the private public, it doesn't mean that intercaste discrimination in the shape of labor exploitation, restricted commensality, and humiliation within neighborly relations are accepted as constitutive of aspirations towards neighborliness. This is the problem of commensality, for example, because commensality both signals caste segregation, and on the other hand, commensality is also about the value of hospitality in India. You're supposed to eat in each. You're supposed to offer food to other people when they come. So commensality strikes at the issue of hospitality and also of caste segregation. And one example of how caste relations constitute the locality, but at the same time are stretched and reconstituted, is the celebration of marriages. So the weddings are huge things. And first, before you get married, then you have the groom visits the bride, and I've been on many of those parties. That's almost always within the caste. You go mainly within the caste to the bride's house. Now grooms go to school with people from other castes, so you will get young people who are mixed in the photographs and so on, but it's still considered as a caste within the caste. But the wedding happens, you're supposed to invite everybody in the neighborhood across caste. Weddings are not within the caste. Now this is if you're a Dalit, weddings can be humiliating experiences. So in the past, Dalits were always served last and seated separately from other castes in these neighborhood weddings, and you never know, people say, whether this is going to happen to you again or not. So it's a source of great uncertainty and discussion. So Velai then, who was somebody I was very close to, who was a very CPM, the branch secretary, when I asked him about his experience of caste discrimination, he immediately told me about a local Irawa wedding that he attended as a young man, where he was served separately and last from his friends who were Irawa, and how humiliating this was as an experience for him. Now it also works that way in Dalit weddings. So in Dalit weddings, you're supposed to, in Kanakan, which is this caste, you're supposed to host the dinner the night before in your house and invite your neighbors. But the Irawa landlord and labourer families would not eat food cooked by Dalit families, so you'd have to provide bought snacks and fruit like bananas sealed, either at the dinner, or you have to send it around to all the family houses even if they don't come. And this is expensive. And also, as Radhika, Veena and Punni William explained to us in a conversation, they saw that as this is really repellent and antisocial behavior. And when I asked in genuine puzzlement what the difference was between bought snacks and food at the dinner time, Veena replied, laughing ruefully but with a strong note of disapproval, they don't want anything that could have been cooked or touched by us. Now, over the last 10 years, all weddings in K Colony no longer happen in the neighborhood. They happen in marriage halls. In fact, and that's because, so families, both Dalit and Irawa, you can actually now get a Brahmin to consecrate your wedding. And everybody from the neighborhood of all castes are invited to go to the marriage hall. It's catered. You don't know the caste of the caterers. Now, these wedding halls show the many changes in Kerala. Right, so you have the performance of a marriage by the Brahmin. It shows both the continuing importance of upper caste practices as constituting consecration, but also that now lower caste communities can have this service extended to them, which is unthinkable about 20 years ago. But the wedding halls also solve the problem of neighborhood commensality because of the catering that's provided at the hall. So marriage halls transform conviviality through basically avoiding confrontation within the locality. Now, do we see this new marriage economies with mixed caste attendance? Do we see this as a transformation of caste commensality, or simply its reorganization? It's an open question. So caste relations have transformed in people's lifetimes, but caste segregation and discrimination continue to be the infrastructure of the everyday common sense of people's lives in neighborhoods and localities, spaces dominated by women. And these things never go without discussion. And that's how I'm going to conclude now in talking about how people actually talk about it. So I'll just conclude with one little story. So the local Hindu temple in K Colony was considered Irawa. And in the last 10 years, they raised all this money and they turned it from a shrine into a temple and got a Brahmin priest. So you can see this is like the marriage halls. This is like profound transformation. On the other hand, they collected all the money for the temple among all the residents. So they also visited the Dalit homes for donations for the temple. However, as Polni Valiamma explained to us, when the shrine was turned into a temple, she and others knew that for festivals there was still a separate place laid for Dalit women to cook rice than from Irawa women. And so she said, when they came to ask us for money for the temple, I said, so we are good enough to take money from, but not to cook our rice in the same place. And she told them she would not contribute. Now the Dalit women in this locality, they participate in the festival procession, but not one woman in this locality cooked rice, did the residents related ritual of cooking rice in the annual festival is a very clear criticism on how the local Irawars had caste segregated a potentially neighborhood festival. And it's a statement, this not cooking is a statement that asserts respect and equality is a fundamental characteristic of neighborliness. Now, yes, historically restricted caste commensality and caste discrimination against Dalit communities have been dominant features of Malayali Kerala society, and no place more than in Palakkad. But Kerala's larger political and economic shifts and the sense that there is an official public where caste discrimination is disallowed has allowed for, on one hand, the re-entrenchment of intra and intercaste relationships within the neighborhood and the locality, but also made possible the reflexive, bitter commentaries by Dalit laborers on the transforming but still segregated neighborhood. They say, so we're not good enough, is it, to cook our rice in the same place. So clearly Dalit communities are deeply structurally disprivileged, and the denial of basic rights and entitlements does constitute the major part of how we might think of a person might be accorded worth. But I've also tried to say that respect is also a project for the people I worked with, even though inequality remains. That it's a project epitomized by this kind of reflexive commentary on relations that continually seem to fall short of acknowledging worth and equality. In the days and evenings that seem to spent in conversation on front yards, inside homes, over tea, talking in interviews, sharing household tasks, and eating together, people continually discuss what could constitute a meaningful social and convivial life. What was respect in relation to eating in other people's homes? What do we do when Irawa women throw up after eating your food? When a contract for catering was withdrawn when it became clear one was Dalit. And they did this all the time while offering us food, coffee and tea without fail. I learned from this an understanding of dignity and worth through these kind of reflexive conversations on life worlds that people lived but were not afforded recognition. Now, what full equality could look like was very distant, given this kind of structural inequality and poverty people lived in. But these intensely critical commentaries were there on how everyday social life could be other and more equal. And this has led me to suggest that the locality and the neighborhood itself was and is also an evolving historical project. And it is this history that gives flesh and complexity to the philosophical problem of ethical relations with those proximate to us. The articulation of desires for dignity and respect, to treat and to be treated and treat each other as human beings, infuses neighborliness with its everyday ethical and political stakes. Living amidst and through long histories of subordination, understanding how one's categorical status provides both for senses of community and togetherness, as well as humiliation, exploitation, exclusion, in the interpersonal as well as the institutional, are the lenses that those who so generously opened their lives to me in Palakkad have taught me to bring back to my new home in America.
Well, she's a bit delinquent, but
I'm so sorry. I got carried away.
On the other hand, we'll exploit her at the end when people who don't get their questions asked will come up afterwards, and she'll, I'm sure, ask. Please raise your hand, and I will give you.
First, thanks, Sharika. It's very rich and very dense and smart. So two questions. I mean, one is just practical. So, I mean, if you look at male and female homosociality in part to set up the possibility of these two publics, the private public and the official public. So I'm just curious, in people's talk or otherwise, do relations, for example, between women and men outside of marriage emerge, for example, a range of relations, intercaste relations, sexually, across the distribution of coerciveness, or not? And how do those, that's the one question. And then do they all appear in conversation? And and how do they inflect the set of, or the shifting grounds for locality, or not, as taught or otherwise. And then the more formal question, one can start from an idea that there is no potential concept of a neighbor, because on both sides there's a fundamental difference in what the relation toward what the other is. And so if there is, as I think is the ground here, the potential conceptualization of neighborliness, one thing it seems you're showing us is this doesn't necessarily come through the imposition or the claim of the human, despite the ways in which the human infuses rhetoric and lament. But it comes through a series of contingent happenings, for example, in the built environment, in which a locality comes to look and be neighborly in a certain kind of way. And there's almost like a kind of as-if humanity. That is, there's a sense that it's not that there's the production of some kind of new formation of the person in which we can then talk about something like neighborliness from both sides, despite casteism, but rather that there is a sedimentation and intensification of a certain space of locality which demands of us the concept of the neighbor, despite the fact that one could argue from the perspective of pure concept that that's impossible.
Do you want me to take it in row? Should I answer?
No, just you answer that one.
Okay. It's a tough one to answer. And I think for the first question, I think, the reason that this kind of male-female talk really matters, and in some ways it's also because the longer I spend in time in the locality, I learn to ask the question about who eats, women or men. I don't think you would automatically think about that, but and when I asked it, people would be very approving. It's like, you've learned something about us, that you know how to ask that question. But Kerala is a very gender segregated society. It's a profound, and it's very different from what I know from Tamil Nadu or in Sri Lanka. I'm always very shocked that of how gender segregated it is, and the kinds of relationships within families. And very often though, gender relations do come up primarily around caste, because it'll be conversations about marriage or intercaste marriage, making a mistake or making a fine. So the two conversations are actually very intertwined as a whole, because on the other hand, you try not to talk about women because you're not supposed to talk about other people's women. So caste and gender, caste and talk about women are very, very intertwined. And it's because of the segregation also of women within the household, even these women who are laboring and have been laboring historically and continually for hundreds of years. It's even, there's all this research that says, okay, Dalit women have much more mobility and freedom than upper caste women. That may have been true in Kerala because you look at Nampudri women and they were so restricted. But on the other hand, Dalit women were not necessarily, they were subject to severe forms of humiliation and also were considered sexually available by the local landlords, as we know from some of the households that I did genealogies for, where you have successive absent fathers, which are actually the landlords' sons. I learned to link the two because that's how it actually how it emerged in many ways. And the spatiality is something conceptual, but also that this came from doing fieldwork and seeing where are the spaces that women are actually allowed to be in, where was even I as a woman allowed to be in. So I have to think a bit more of the ethnographic connotations, but I'm also mindful that I have to answer your second question, which is also very substantial. I think this question is complicated on two fronts, because one, we're used to talking about humanity and the human in relation to the kind of genealogy of the human rights in Western Europe. There's a literature review in which we're supposed to cite whenever we talk about the human. And yet, it's a concept that's very strong, not among other castes, but among Dalits, the idea of being human is very strong. And at least in South India, it's very much sedimented through actually the writings of 19th century leaders, and there's a lot of conversation about it, in fact. And in some ways, I think that That's why, in some ways, Dalit claims for emancipation are very, very successful, because they're informed by something substantive, like the idea we are human. It's not just transcending something to get to another thing or a new form emerging out of it. There's an assertion around it. I think the locality does matter greatly, because if Nate Roberts has written his brilliant ethnography in Chennai, where he talks also about how people say we're just human, but they mean it in a different way, because they live in an urban neighborhood where everybody's Dalit. They say the other people care about caste, we don't care about caste, we are just human. Now, in a rural area where I work, where you do live with other castes, and they are landlords, you can't get away. People also say we are human, and a human being is a human, but they do say we care about caste because they have to engage with it. But what is continuous is that there's a very strong, this idea of Manithan, in both in Malayalam and in Tamil, of this humanness is very, very significant. And I think it's different from, so a lot of the critiques of the dignity and respect within the Western canon, so a lot of people like Ruth Macklin and so on say, well, dignity is a very empty concept, or legally it doesn't mean anything. It's because it's very much linked to this idea of the individual, and that's quite different in India, where you have a similar history and a shared genealogy, but where it's really not been about individual rights. It's been about establishing substantial communities with substance to it, and the concept of the human has been absolutely central to that, and that has its own local genealogy and terms. So it's a bit like the discussion, but it's at the same time you can't say it's an empty, that language is empty in India the way that you might be able to say it's empty and I think that's why I think it's very interesting exactly that these contingent happenings, these localities in fact, and spaces by which you imagine yourself bringing it in being. So Ram Rawat has written about how, in fact, locality and space is one of the things that we should be writing more about when we talk about Dalits, because of historical segregation and the ways in which that segregation has both, segregated people, but also allowed autonomous worlds to flourish. So he suggests that we look not only at human dignity but also at space, and how particular kinds of spaces have brought forms into being. So I'm totally with you. That's why I sort of think about this thing as not intentional history, but these things happen, these changes happen, and here we are, we deal with it in that way. Does that make some sort of sense? Sorry, it's only a beginning.
Yes, agreed. Yes, agreed.
Thank you, Sharika. It was a very interesting talk. I just had a question about the Dalit communities that you work with. I was thinking of the concept, Ambedkarite concept of graded inequality.
Sorry, say it again?
Graded inequality.
Okay, yeah.
And I was wondering whether the Dalit caste that you worked with, you talked about the interaction between the Dalits and the upper caste, then Dalit, but how about the interaction between the Dalit caste? Because Dalit, it's not a binary notion. Caste is like multi-layered. And if we compare it to, top of my head, the caste in Tamil Nadu, Vanars, Puthirai Vanars, and they are the lowest of the low even within the Dalit caste, and even Dalits want to interact with them. So did you see any that sort of interaction where even within these Dalit castes there were like some sort of hierarchy? Did you see? Because my research is on Punjab, and in Punjab, even within Dalit communities, there's lots and lots of hierarchies. The other thing I was wondering was, particularly in northern India, most of the caste discrimination seems to be prejudice rather than pollution. In Kerala, it seems to be more of pollution rather than prejudice. And of course, it's ironical that the most literate state in the country, the most highest sex ratio in the country, and this I'm just trying to wrap my head around it, and would love to know what you feel about it.
Okay, I'm going to try and answer those succinctly.
So like one-word answers from her. These two questions would be just one-word answers.
I hope.
Just wondering about what were the wages of these Dalit workers, and because of the Communist Party and the Communist state was they regulated, were they getting good wages, and did remittances make any difference in those communities?
Okay, so I'm going to be succinct, or you want me to collect?
I'm going to get another question in because I have
Yeah.
a feeling that.
Okay, let's collect 2 or 3 and I'll answer very succinctly.
I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned that some of the Dalit communities moved in next to someone of higher caste. How did they start negotiating water and sanitation use, particularly with using latrines, or if there was open defecation and the idea of pollution and how, and with the Swachh Bharat campaign?
Yes.
My experience in Dalit communities in India is mostly with Ambedkarite Buddhist communities, where there's both an individual and collective, communal transformation of identity. And I wondered if that was something that exists in any way, the identity to a Buddhist identity. I wonder if that's something that exists in Kerala, in the communities you were.
Okay.
Yes.
I was wondering how caste functions in Jaffna right now, and how it functioned in the Elam IDP camps.
Okay, that's about Sri Lanka. Okay.
And lastly,
I was wondering if movements like Kumbhasri have had any effect on women working together, and because in my field work in Kerala, I found that space was people talked about space in a very different way if they were part of this locality where there had been like communist struggles going on, or there were places where there were different castes, different religions worked together in some kind of a public sphere. It was very different from the kind of interactions that happened when there were like struggles, choir workers struggles or things like that. So 2 questions really, one about space and the other about Kudumbasri and its impact on women's lives.
Okay. All right, I'm going to be one-word answers to everything.
Yeah.
All right. So the most important thing to remember is the presence of the Communist Party and the CPM, which I'm actually writing about in other things, which is that there was not, the CPM both provided all this kind of emancipatory languages and changes in some ways, but also significantly suppressed any Dalit movement from arising. Right, so you don't. The kind of ways you're meant to get your emancipation and so on is through the Communist Party. You're not supposed to go and have a Dalit branch of it, or so on and so forth. So everything is conducted through that. In fact, if that answers your question, and people. So there were no very big active Dalit movements locally. It was all, and so it was very much masked. It was all about the laboring poor. That's the language, and so you're not supposed to talk about caste in that. And political rallies were very big intercaste spaces that I went to. Kudumbasri, in fact, was very big in the colonies. It's how the Enrega, the work was done, was through Kudumbasri. So the woman working in the Kudumbasri would manage the logbooks. In fact, I went to Kudumbasri offices very often and I knew all the things. But so that expanded actually. I mean, it's very difficult to say. Women already worked here. There's no expansion of women's work in these areas. These are laboring women. They've always worked. It's a reorganization of their work. But what the Enrega work did was actually provide income when there was no income anymore because of landlords. So without the Enrega work and all this organization, there would be no work for women. There would be a profound collapse. But it's not about the expansion of women's rights or work for laboring women who already have that kind of ability. But the Kudumbasri in Kerala works better than most other places in Kerala. Most things in Kerala work better than most other states in India, and that's one of the reasons I went to study caste in Kerala, not because it's one of the most, because it shows, we're so advanced and yet it has this. I went to study it because I wanted to see what happens in a context where things actually work. How do we understand caste? When we can't say it's because of the failure of the state to provide public services and so on. I wanted to have that rather than this other, and plus Kerala is nice to be in, but I have language for it. But I wanted to have that rather than this oblique contrast, but to say, okay, actually public services do work. There are panchayat schemes, there is money, there are these things, all of these things actually happen, and so how do we understand caste in this context? The question about, So I don't think it's actually, and the reason I'm not taking a position on the pollution versus prejudice is that actually most Dalits in India do not perform polluting work. They are agricultural laborers. That's the communities I work with. It's not about them being involved in polluting work or doing things that are considered polluting. And that's they themselves are considered polluting, but they have been agricultural laborers, as far as I can see from records, for hundreds of years. They're not leather workers, scavengers, and in some of the new Dalit work, scholars are actually talking very strongly about how, in fact, most Dalits do not engage in the traditional labor that they are supposedly associated with, and then how do we think about how the pollution is sort of framed when we say that the typical Dalit is actually an agricultural laborer in some fashion or another. Or in the case of the Chamas, Ram Ramat has talked about agricultural workers, not necessarily laborers. So that's complicated. The ranking between is a very complicated question because there's a big debate within South Indian caste scholarship where some scholars like Michael Moffat and so on say, well, Dalits basically accept their own low status because they also rank Dalits also rank each other, so that means that they basically accept the principles of the caste hierarchy. Then you have all these other people who come along and say, but look, the way that Dalits treat other Dalits is still not the same as the way that upper caste treat Dalits. It's not like same, the way in which the ranks follow and the observations that you see from upper to lower are still nowhere as rigid. I mean, how Dalits rank each other is nowhere comparable to the very rigid form. So that's not me. I mean, that's a lot of scholars who said these are not like very directly comparable. And and there's also this question of, well, don't we think about caste in terms of this is a structural livelihood question that make it very difficult to say whether you accept or not accept. You also have, in terms of the Dalit communities in relation to each other, definitely, undoubtedly, the Pariah community was considered the lowest community by all the Dalits that I worked with. Now, there were, in fact, people talked about, well, we don't actually do this amongst each other. So since the 90s, actually, a lot of the Dalit communities are very careful not to observe caste discrimination in relation to each other because they don't want to be like the upper caste. But they will tell you, oh, those pariahs, yeah, they are snake charmer, or they're magicians, they change shape. In the past, we used to throw water in case so there are undoubtedly these things, and it's very marked on the pariah community because they were and I worked with the pariah colony too. They were the poorest in terms of wages and income out of all of and the most segregated in terms of where they were. But I would say that the kind of observances that you see between middle caste and Dalits, the segregation, you just don't see that kind of rigidity between Dalit caste. It's much more flexible, and it's much more changeable. So there is ranked inequality, but it's qualitatively different. That, in my opinion, that kind of ranking, and it's between the communities that I work with. However, politically, it's quite central. It's not central in Kerala because different communities just are ranked as Dalit or rather SCs. In other places like Maharashtra, it matters if you're Maha or Mang because they have political entities that come along with it. There hasn't been any community by community mobilization as such in this area. So they still just see themselves all as SC. But they don't marry across. Nobody marries across. As I found out. So that's a ranking question. Wages, until the 1980s, unlike the rest of Kerala, women in this men and women in this area were still paid in rice, not in money. So the rest of Kerala, they were paid in money. But in I've been doing wage data across generations in households because I want to know empirically what's going on. So it's only really changed in the 60s, and no, in the 70s, it changed, where the amount of rice you got became a little bit more. It's these measurements called idangari. Now, Francis Buchanan in 1806 recorded the same amount of idangari that women were getting as they were getting when I recorded the 1960s. So it was wages were flat because they're measures and they're physical measures rather than changeable valuations of money for about 200 something years. In the 70s, women and men went on strike, long strikes, in the area I work in for 3 years. Also aided by the CPM actually in that case, because it's for both Dalit and Irava laborers. They got higher amounts of rights, it changed to the wages. But wages in Palakkad are still lower than everywhere else in Kerala, but much higher than anywhere else in India. So women get 250 to 300 rupees. And men get 500 to 550. But in this district, it's considered one of the really backward districts, even though it's a communist district. Amusingly, whenever I ask people why they thought that, they would say, well, it's very close to the Tamil Nadu border. So it must be something Tamil. And I was like, well, I'm not sure. The Tamils, they can't bear the burden of the lower wages in this district. Just our proximity does not poison income inequality. But what else am I trying to answer? The Sri Lanka question, I'm going to say it because it's really very complicated. And it's different from though I have looked at some of the similar things of how people live together in Sri Lanka, but in relation to both caste and also ethnicity, Muslim, Tamil. But that's a different set of things. But as a whole, this is something I've tried to do in both Sri Lanka and in India, which is just look at these kind of very everyday relations of how people negotiate lives together in a way that's not about providing this kind of overly positive, hey, look at how coexistence works, but just how do people do it and how do they navigate the kinds of histories that they do. And I think that's a very big question here in the US. I don't think that any of us can not think about this in America too. I mean, this country is a perfect example for me of all the things I see in India. I see it here too. So, your question, oh my goodness, your question was about
the sanitation piece.
Everybody has their own toilet. That's the piece which has to do with the CPM and has to do with the actually effective public services. Everybody has their own toilets, but the water source is organized through the caste stations. So now, when I was there, everybody was talking about whether you should have individual meters in each other's houses. And that's a very big, complicated question because people borrow water from each other all the time within the caste group. You just go to your neighbor. But once you get your individual meter, people are like, well, this is me, we're going to charge our neighbors for. So it is a neighborhood issue, but it's an issue also around the fact that there actually is provision.
And it's their pit latrines? Their pit latrines?
Yeah, behind houses.
So will they ever need to be emptied out, and who will be emptying them out?
So this is also, so people actually try very much to have flushing or they have pit latrines, but these are communities that do actually do it, and there is a municipal service. Unfortunately, this colony I'm talking about is right next to the waste. So what's very common about Dalit colonies is they're next to cemeteries, waste, municipal dump grounds. I mean, these are all the places that I've worked with. So there's an association of the place, yes, with waste and with various kind of waste, but that's not something that people talk about, that everybody does. There is an understanding that there is a municipality. It does provide for things. There is a state that, to some extent, works. But it works differently for Dalits than it does for other people.
Well, time has come, and I know we have lots of other questions, but please join me in thanking you. I hope we get a chance to. I have just I have to go to a factory meeting right now. But do you have your card?
No, but I shall. But do I have a card? Do I have a card? I got a whole lot of cards for India because everybody.
Yeah, I know everybody has a card. I
but
do
I
too.
don't know if I have a card.
But you know what? This will help you.
Yes, that's a
And why
better.
not? And maybe at some point maybe I can get down to Stanford and come back over there and talk further about what the projects are. This is really great stuff. And I wish I had more time to talk to you.
Oh, I agree. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's exciting to have Thank you.
It was a fascinating
Oh,
talk.
you
I
think
wanted
it was
to
okay?
give you a copy of that. And, a lot of it's very simply written. because it was for a simple audience, but a bunch of it is basically the story of the students in this school who are from everywhere.
I'm really. Did you feel that